So good morning and welcome to this morning's webinar. We are joined by Patrick Oniyelu from Clarity Business Travel and Andrew Perolls from Greengage. Next slide, please, Grace. As I said, I'm Jayne Thorn. I'm the Head of Category Management Services at SUPC, and I also look after the travel category. So this slide just gives us a quick overview of what we're going to see today. So we're going to have Andrew who's going to set the scene. And he's got a really good overview of sustainability in the sector. We're going to go for a Q&A. As I said, there is polls during this one, so watch out for the polls. I think they start quite early. So we're going to have the Q&A after Andrew's session. Then Patrick's going to give us an overview of what Clarity are doing in this section, in this area. And then we're going to have some more questions. And then we're going to have 6 takeaways. Now, the questions after Andrew's is going to be quite a short window. So when you put your question in the Q&A, have a look what's already in there and upvote the question that you want answered as a priority. If we don't get through them all, we'll try to add them on at the end of Patrick's session. And if we've still got questions after, we'll see if we can get a written Q&A out to you afterwards. But Patrick and Andrew are, they're at the end of a phone anyway. So next slide, please. Brilliant. I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who's the CEO at Greengage. Andrew, over to you. Take it from here. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And hello, good morning and welcome. And it's great to be joined by so many people interested in the concept of sustainable travel. There's a lot to talk about on this topic, and I'm hoping that what we'll get in the session today is to cover 3 things. Really, first of all, to shed some light on why it's so important to reduce carbon emissions. I'm going to share my thoughts on a practical approach to sustainable travel, and finally provide some takeaways for today. Hope that's okay. So first of all, though, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions which will give me an insight as to where you are on your sustainable journey. So if we could see the poll questions, please. So the first question is, does your organisation have a specific target date, specific target date to achieve net zero carbon emissions? To be 2030, for example. And the second one, does your institution have a sustainability strategy and carbon reduction plan which considers business travel within it? So if you can vote for that, that would be really a very insightful to see where you are on that. Okay, so we're almost there. Most people have voted, and yeah, I think we're there. Okay, so if we could just show the results then. So you can see, this is interesting. So in terms of having a specific target date to achieve net zero carbon emissions, very high, 87%. That's very, very good. Actually, that's quite different to, for example, if there was an audience with a lot of manufacturers and other types of organisation. So very, very good. That's very helpful in having something as a basis for a sustainable travel policy. The second one, about whether travel is specifically covered within your policy, then yes is just under half. So that's interesting as well, isn't it? So we can kind of see what needs working on. Okay, very good, and I'll come back to those, I think, as we go on. Okay, so as Professor Chris Whitty would say, can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so perhaps I should just explain what Greengage Solutions is. We're an independent consultancy. We help companies on the sustainability journey, and we specialise in travel and events. And what we do is we offer practical advice. We have our EcoSmart accreditation, and we also do training. We work with a wide range of organisations, corporates, institutions, travel management companies, and hotels. EcoSmart, if you've heard of it, it's the UK's fastest growing network of green certified hotels and meeting venues, including a number of universities. My background, I've been a very keen advocate of sustainability. I combined that with many years in the corporate travel sector, working for people like CTM, BCD, Reed & Mackay, and I've also been a corporate travel buyer as well. Next. So the whole concept of sustainability from a business perspective can be confusing. I don't know if you ever feel like this, loads of terminology being thrown around and trying to work out the differences between zero carbon, carbon neutral, net zero carbon, all that sort of thing. Next. An image of Earth. Well, I think somehow this one image encapsulates how tiny our planet actually is and how precious. And it is our only world, and if we don't look after it, there's no planet B. But for many years, scientists have tried to alert us to the dangers of climate change, but those calls have gone largely unheeded. Next. So now we have really a global emergency, and it was described by the IPCC last year as a code red for humanity. So that sounds pretty serious. And so looking at this slide, this has to be our focus. We have to stop global temperatures rising by reducing greenhouse gases, but it's not just about global warming and gas emissions. We need to protect our precious natural ecosystems and look after the planet's incredible biodiversity. We need to conserve natural resources like forests and fish stocks. Plus, we need to reduce waste and drastically cut the amount of single-use plastic that's seriously polluting every corner of our planet. So it all adds up to sustainability, needing that, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations. So how's it going? Next. Well, global levels of CO2 have to fall by 50% by 2050. By 2030, and hit net zero by 2050. That is, if we want to avoid really irreversible temperature rises and the devastation that would cause. Next. So, if you can see the next slide. Levels fell slightly in 2020 for obvious reasons, but on current trends, CO2 emissions will actually not go down, but go up, actually rise from 55 billion tonnes per annum to 60 by 2030, which is a 10% rise when we want a 50% decrease. Next. So this picture is a kind of representation if we had to try and visualize 1 tonne out of the 55 billion. So imagine 55 billion of that going into the atmosphere, and it creates a layer that holds heat in and unfortunately doesn't disappear for over 1,000 years. Next. A bit of a busy graph, but what you might see from here is that transport is the 4th biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and in the past 30 years, whereas power and industry are down, if you can see those lines on there, UK travel and transport emissions have actually risen, and it's one of the worst performing industry sectors. Take the break over the past 2 years, of course. What happens next remains to be seen. Is the hope? Could we see net emission flights anytime soon? So I thought I'd share my thoughts on this. So the Department of Transport's launched a policy called Jet Zero, aiming to reduce emissions from aviation to net zero by 2050. And that's not going to be easy, especially as predictions are still for a very substantial growth in flying over that period. So what can you do? Really, there's 3 things. You could have electric aircraft, you can change the fuels of existing planes or take emissions out of the atmosphere. Now, when it comes to electric planes, there's some progress. There are now light aircraft powered by electricity. You'd expect a range of about 100 miles and 1 hour's flying time, which is not a lot. but we're seeing, short hop flights potential, like they're trialling in the Western Isles of Scotland. But it's a long way off medium and long haul flights. And of course, about 80% of aviation emissions are from flights over 1,000 miles. And if you imagine turning up on a flight at Frankfurt Airport, what the airline wants to do is turn that flight around quickly and come back the other way. If you're charging a plane up, not so simple. So I think maybe 2035 might see the first commercial flights, maybe. But of course, we need to be down 50% on our emissions by then. So it's kind of too long. We need to do something before that. Talking about the fuels, then you've really got biofuels, synthetic fuels, or even hydrogen. Biofuels are a thing. And United and Delta, for example, they run flight Chicago to LA, which are 30% biofuel. Issues are it's very expensive, 2 to 3 times more expensive than the normal fuels. There's not enough of it produced, and there are concerns about land use. If a lot of land was used for growing, which is then used in the biofuel, what happens to the other crops? So I think the expectation is there may be commercial air flights, 100% biofuel by about 2033, hydrogen potentially, which is very good because only water comes from after hydrogen is used. Perhaps commercial flights by 2035. The third thing you could do is remove emissions from the atmosphere. Well, there's no viable options yet invented. You need great big machines that suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. They're not really on the cards yet. So you can offset, and that's doing something. That's good. EasyJet, for example, they offset their flights. But I'd just say we have to be careful. The message shouldn't be travel as normal. We have it covered. Because it's a bit like, I sometimes say, it can be like paying someone to go on a diet for you. Not only that, but we're actually starting to see, believe it or not, a shortage of offsets. Everybody wants them now, and guess what? The price per ton is now going up. So I think dreaming of electric planes and planting trees won't save the planet. You actually have to reduce the amount of flying that happens. And an interesting fact: 1% of the world population who are the frequent flyers are responsible for 50% of aviation emissions. So if we could reduce the frequent traveller number of flights. Okay, next slide, please. So this is where we are. We are at a point where every nation, every government, organisation and individual has to do something. And if we can mend the hole in the ozone layer, which we've done, we can create a COVID vaccine in less than a year, we have the ingenuity to tackle this too. Next. So I think companies, institutions are getting it, and they're deciding they must do something. And in the past 2 years, we've seen a steady stream of commitments from organisations like the ones you see here. AstraZeneca, for example, net zero carbon by 2025 and expecting to be carbon negative by 2030. NHS, carbon net zero by 2040. So this year we're going to see a lot of organisations focusing on their supply chain and making sure they're working with companies that have green credentials. And actually, organisations are realising that acting sustainably can make them more successful, as well as contributing to a better planet. Next. So this is how it's reflected in the world of travel procurement. A blizzard of new demands like carbon reporting and green travel policy. I don't know if any of that sounds familiar to you. Next. So I just thought I would share with you some research that Business Travel News completed in 2021. It was a big survey trying to get an insight into travel buyer attitudes towards sustainability. And you can see from the answer to these questions, it's obviously becoming much more of a priority. Next. So a lot of the buyers in that survey talked about the need to manage sustainability targets. And these were the top six things overall that came out. So next, let's now take a look at the key priorities of SUPC members based on your feedback when you registered for this event. You can see here some real key things came out about sustainable travel options, carbon reporting, travel reduction, social value or having a positive effect, carbon offsetting, and communication with bookers. Next. So let's take a look at how you might want to approach developing a more sustainable travel program. To be honest, the most effective strategy is to not travel at all. It's a great way of reducing carbon emissions, but I'm not here to advocate that. Business travel is a vital component of our economy. You know, I mean, a pharmaceutical company developing cancer drugs, would we suggest that their scientists don't travel to research meetings and instead stay on Zoom call communication? Of course not. So it's more about finding ways to act and travel smarter. And if you're tasked with finding a way to reduce your company's carbon emissions or implement a sustainability strategy, I would advocate taking a three-step approach. It's really, number one, understand what you're trying to achieve in this and have a way to measure your progress. Secondly is take action that will deliver your goals. And third, work with partners who can help you in the journey. Next. So firstly, it's really important to set yourself objectives which align with your institution's overall approach. And it was obvious from the survey response, the poll response, that most institutions have an overall target, but only around half, which is still actually quite good, but half also have travel targets factored in as well. So I think it's really good to understand fully your organisation's goals and how travel fits into that. And are there any specific travel targets already? I'd say go through a green health check with your travel management company. What is currently being measured? What's in place to help you act greener? Where are the gaps? And then make sure you set some targets based on your organisation's approach. So, for example, if you have a target to get to carbon net zero, you kind of need to have staging posts along the way. If it was 2030, what are you going to do this year, next year, the year after? An example would be Novo Nordisk that we've done some work with. They have a set target of a 50% reduction in air travel emissions by 2025 compared to 2019. Make sure you've got a way of accurately tracking emissions data as well, and create an actual plan with timelines and look at what's the low-hanging fruit. Hope that makes sense. And if we go to the next slide, the plan might include these components. It's a sort of logical hierarchy of actions. So avoid travel, reduce it, choose more eco-travel options, and carbon offset what's left. So I'm just going to run through the 4 layers of the pyramid one by one. So next, first, it's really about challenging if travel is necessary. Do you actually need to travel? This is about resetting expectations often. And I think, especially for internal meetings, we now have got used to most meetings being possible online, but it's really important just to make sure you've got good technology in place, telepresence potentially. And what travel authorization process do you have in place? Is there a sign-off? you do need to make sure that travel is justified with a reason for the trip, ideally, and that it's within travel policy. So review the policy and if necessary, tighten it up. And travel management companies will normally have an automated process to make it as slick as possible, and things like reason codes. Next. Okay, so I'm going to come on to talking about reducing or at least justifying travel by managing booker behaviour. And this is where a good travel policy comes in. So I'm just going to ask this poll question. So have you changed your travel policy to drive better sustainable buying? Okay. So it's looking, this is interesting. Okay. So I think we're nearly there. Okay. Okay, can we share the results? Yeah. So it's around about half who don't have a specific kind of green travel policy. So that's interesting. Good. Okay, that's what I expected. So let's talk a little bit more about that then. Thanks, Bertie. Okay. Well, I would strongly advise that you do review your travel policy if you haven't so far, and see if it's green fit for purpose. Once it's in place, police it using travel management company data to identify anyone out of policy. So the question is, what is a green policy? What might it include? And I could do a whole session just on this. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about this. If you want to see an example of a green travel policy, you can Google it, WWF, not the wrestling, World Wildlife Fund. Their travel policy is on there. It's quite an interesting, good one. But it's things really like alternatives to travel before traveling in. Sorry, alternatives to travel before traveling in person. It would be things like not traveling business class, if you were lucky enough to normally do that. It's twice the CO2 level of economy. Taking train for domestic UK journeys instead of air. Discouraging 1 or 2 day trips, combining several trips into one. Using direct flights. And sometimes, an interesting one, no frequent flyer points for travellers, because of course it does tend to encourage people to travel as much as they can. I just wanted to touch on what maybe a very eco-travel policy looks like. And I picked for this Lush. They've got 900 shops in 49 countries, so they do need to travel. But their kind of policy, their approach is to say that they are wanting to contribute to life rather than contributing to human extinction. So that sounds pretty serious stuff, doesn't it? They have a very strict authorization. And on air, as an example, they actually say no fly policy for door-to-door journeys under 8 hours. They actually tried an internal carbon tax on flights, £50 per tonne of CO2, and then used that to fund groups opposing aviation and fracking. Unfortunately, it encouraged people because they thought they were contributing to something good because of the £50 going to those causes, so they took that out. But interestingly, if you ask them the question, where a traveller says, do you want me to pay £180 for a return train ticket or get a flight for £50? Then Lush would say, you paid the 180. It's important to us. There's a good article on Lush. I can share that after this if you're interested. So, all right. So let's now go to the next slide. Once you've been authorised and you know what's within travel policy, what next? Well, I think one of the biggest single steps you can take is to provide a travel booker with the information they need to make an informed decision, the ability to switch to more carbon efficient transport. So the great thing is that online booking technology is really advancing fast. towards allowing visibility of things like emissions per flight, and then being able to compare it with, say, a flight or Eurostar to Paris. Being able to show the difference between airlines on the same route, because it can be a lot of difference depending on the sort of planes that are used, or even the difference between one airport and another. If you went to Glasgow and you went from London Gatwick, it would be 43% difference in CO2 compared to London City, because the planes go up very steeply, burn a lot of fuel. Great to be able to also show in the booking field, on an online booking tool, the rail option, which is often 85 to 90% less than air. Great also, we're beginning to see, as this develops more and more, the ability to have messaging pop-ups encouraging people to make a greener choice, and trying to relate carbon to something people understand, like saying, if you take this flight, it's equivalent to your entire household emissions for a year. Then that kind of means something to people. So if we could just move on a slide. Don't forget hotel accommodation. Often represents about 21% of total. So do look at this, and there are ways that you can look at a greener program. So if we go on to the next one. Rail, if you look at the other means of transport, rail is a very green option. Some organisations, they're writing into travel policies city pairs where they recommend you use rail rather than air. Could be UK, Western Europe, China, Japan are the kind of the markets. And there are some low-cost train options now. Lumo, I notice, they're saying that they're low-cost rail to Edinburgh, and they undertake that 60% of their fares are no more than £30. Interesting. Taxis, some Addison Lee, now fully electric fleet by 2023. What I would say, it's so important to communicate with bookers and stakeholders so that they buy into what we're doing. We really have to win hearts and minds here, and try to integrate sustainability into your traveller engagement strategy. So also do make sure you're tracking emissions, because what gets measured tends to get done. Next. Now, we all know that carbon net zero travel is very difficult without partially offsetting emissions. So you can offset unavoidable carbon with a good carbon offset partner. So the decisions you have to be made are, is it for you? Are you just offsetting air or other things like hotel? Look at the type of project to support. Ideally, it's beyond emissions reduction to also local community benefits that help reduce reliance on fossil fuels. And then decide, will you activate purchase at time of booking, or is it a central bulk purchase? But the most important thing, always treat it as an accessory to carbon reduction, not the main component. And make sure you have verifiable third-party standards like the gold standard. Okay, so I'm just going to go on now. The next slide is to the third step of the three, which is really just making sure you've got the right partners for your sustainability journey. It is a real complex area, and the collaborative approach is great. And you might include some or all of these partners here, like Clarity and SUPC. You might also find it helpful to have a specialist advisor like us to either focus on specific things or help pull everything together. Next. If you're traveling a TMC, I would recommend you do careful due diligence to not only provide you with the support that you need, but also make sure they practice what they preach in the way they act as a business. The top little section on my slide there. Next. So there it is. There's the kind of simple Greengage three-step approach, and setting your goals, working out your actions, and making sure you've got support. And I know in the sort of institutions you have a lot of internal support potentially as well, which is fantastic. So the final thing really was just I was asked to sort of have 6 takeaways, and I think there's been a lot of takeaways from this, and it's good that this is recorded, and maybe if you want to go back to things you can, but I've included on this next slide just maybe highlighting 6 things that you can do. If we can look at the next slide. So the green health check, really what have you got in place? I think it's important. Create your plan of actions and targets to reduce carbon. Decide what's the emission data requirements that you have. Definitely reviewing and tightening travel authorization, reviewing travel policy and enforcing it using data. And importantly, with your travel management company and online booking tool, assess the point of booking options for informed decisions. Final slide, I think, coming up. So, final thing to say, if you want to know more about how we could help you on your sustainability journey, do take a look at their website, and we'd love you to get in touch anytime for a chat in any case. Okay, so that's my presentation. So I think there's another slide which says Q&A. So very happy to chat about anything that arises from that before we go and talk to Patrick from Clarity.
So Patrick Oniyelu is our business development manager and academic travel lead from Clarity. So I'm going to hand over to you, Patrick. Please take it away.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jane. Next slide, please, Grace. So I'll start to preview what I'm going to say by a few things, which is the fact that, and an obvious one is the fact that we're on a journey. But the journey is not a sprint, but it's neither a marathon in the sense that, you know, we can't get there quickly because we're still on a journey of discovery. But we can't take too long either because, you know, we need to do stuff. So there's something we need to do. We're on a journey. There's so many things we don't know. And certainly going by the nature of questions that we've seen so far, it's obvious that everyone's kind of almost groping through the dark here, trying to find out what can we do without jeopardizing business as usual. There will be difficult decisions to be made, certainly on the part of buyers, and certainly within this sector. And I think Andrew alluded to a few of those. And I suppose the most controversial one is avoiding travel altogether. That's going to be a difficult thing for some people to accept. But the fact of the matter is, that's going to be one of those things that has to be done in order to make sure that we can achieve those targets that we've all set for ourselves. But of course, doing nothing is certainly not an option here. And the status quo is just something that we just can't live with anymore. So we certainly won't have all the answers, but what we've started doing at Clarity is focusing on what we know we can do. So those 17 UN sustainability goals is our starting point. And as the slide here will indicate, in terms of good health and well-being, gender equality, consumption and production goals, climate action and partnership for the goals. These are things we know at Clarity we can do. And it's important that delegates know that this is what we're doing internally, certainly within Clarity. And of course, the external part of these sustainability goals is to make sure that we're also helping our customers achieve those goals as well, which is where the partnerships for the goals actually come into their own. Next slide, please, Grace. So what's our sustainability plan? Our plan is that we will be carbon neutral and audited independently by 2030. And we are actively doing that in conjunction, as it turns out, with Greengage. So we certainly want to make sure that we're looking after employees by paying them the real living wage, because that is part of the sustainability objective, or certainly from a corporate social responsibility perspective. We also need to ensure that our supply chains conform with those those all-important UN goals, and there are ways by which we're able to verify that. But certainly for the purposes of this conversation today is to support you, our customers, and of course those who are not yet our customers, but certainly from a learning perspective, achieve those all important sustainable goals and programs. Next one, please, Grace. So what does sound supplier sourcing actually mean? It means that we work with those that provide the content that you book and ensure that they are in tune with our values of equal opportunities, certainly in terms of work, in terms of the diversity and slavery and gender equality, and of course, anti-poverty. We need them to convince us that they are in tune with those ideas. And it's a good thing to have. And certainly that's part of that United Nations goal. The other one is to obviously make sure that the suppliers can demonstrate that to us ethically, and that they have that commitment to sound sourcing. So, for instance, we need to know that what is it they're trying to do at their end to make sure that those carbon emissions are kept to the lowest possible level. So every hotel that we use, we're working with them to make sure that they tell us exactly how they're working towards reducing wastage. So I suppose when you go to hotels these days, you tend to find advisories telling you to use the same towel rather than having to change towels all the time while you're there for maybe 2 or 3 days. Again, that's part of their drive to reduce their carbon footprint, and that's just one example. But we also want to make sure that we're working with suppliers with those credentials, even if it has to cost a little bit more. I seem to remember not a few years ago, quite a few years ago, certainly within the travel industry and for most customers within the higher education sector, the number one priority used to be cost. We need to reduce cost, and that's still a laudable objective to achieve, because of course we want to get value for money. The second most important objective was risk mitigation, making sure that travelers are able to travel safely, and of course that's still a very important objective. Now it's sustainability, and it's interesting, since COP26 and certainly in the last 2 years, that has now become the number one priority. And it's interesting how everything has gone full circle, that sustainability is now their most important objective, followed by risk, followed by cost. It's a complete inverse of what it was before. It used to be cost, risk, and sustainability. Now it's sustainability, risk, and cost. Interesting. Next slide, please, Grace. So how do we support our customers on this very long journey? So what we've been doing here at Clarity is to make sure that we give you the data, because without data, you can't do anything. And I think Andrew alluded to that during his presentation. And therefore, with that data, you're able to develop what we will call a benchmark to measure your CO2 emission reductions. And we're able to provide that at every point during a given client's travel program. But of course, also making sure that those who book travel, certainly your stakeholders, are given what we call non-travel options at each point of sale. So what I mean by that is every time you want to book travel, there will always be a prompt that will ask whether you really need to take up that trip. Call it visual guilt, call it anything, but we certainly need to push that program and that thought process that ensures that people just don't feel the need to travel when they don't really have to. And of course, making sure that where people do need to travel, that we're providing at the point of sale a lower carbon option where it's viable and feasible. But also making sure that we're given access to those carbon reports and analysis online, but also on demand. It's all well and good talking about data, but more often than not, certainly with travel managers in the back end, they want to see that data in real time. And we've worked really hard to make sure that we're able to provide that information even before travelers commence that trip, so they can see what the trajectory of their carbon emissions is likely to be in a given period of time. But of course, travel is inevitable. And of course, making sure you have a carbon offset partner in place is as important. The ability to offset your carbon if travel must be undertaken also is something that we're helping towards our customers' journey. Next slide, please. So developing a carbon reduction benchmark is going to be very important. I think, yeah, so what we're going to do is, or what we have done actually, is we have a tool, certainly for those of you who are current Clarity customers, we provided you with an online reporting tool called Go2 Insight. And that tool is being developed every single day, certainly from a carbon information perspective, making sure that you're able to get as much information as you can, calculated using DEFRA measures. So what you're looking at there is just a snapshot of what, I suppose, a dashboard of a particular university or college for that matter, in terms of what they've done by department, and the ability to drill down that data by faculty, cost center, department, or the entire institution as a whole, and broken down by the types of trips that have been undertaken, whether it's short haul, long haul, or just domestic. Next slide, please. So here's a poll question for you, and I hope this one will really get you thinking. Can we have the question up, please? Will your travelers or bookers select a more sustainable option, even if it could cost more money? This is a controversial question, but it will be interesting to see what the thought process is before I go to the next slide. This is no surprise at all. I'm seeing here. Yeah. Let's share this, Grace. So no surprises at all. As I said, this is a journey, and it's going to take a while. So it's no surprise here that the majority are going for the don't know or actually know part of that question, and it's no surprise at all, because cost is still a factor in the decision-making process. And this is where the thought, the change in thinking has to come in, because to achieve sustainability, it's going to cost money. It's not cheap. It's as I said, everything we do now has to point towards that priority, because but you know, I'm not surprised. But yeah, thanks for that, Grace. That's an interesting analysis there. So next slide, please. So low carbon options at the point of sale. So what we're doing is prompting sustainability through choice. So where there is a flight and a low carbon option in place, we want to, and we're certainly helping our customers push through the agenda of using a lower carbon option, and making sure that the carbon options are displayed at the point of sale. So you can see that screenshot at the bottom of that page. That's going to be a typical example of what we'll be doing going forward. So this is a British Airways trip from London Heathrow to Geneva. So it's cheap. It's £58.67. Brilliant, not bad at all. But look at the international rail option there from London to Geneva, and that's using international rail service. That's going to be Eurostar, and then obviously beyond Eurostar. That's slightly more expensive, but you can tell that it's a considerably lower carbon emission compared to the British Airways carbon emissions. So the question is, how many of you today would say go for the international rail option? Yes, it's going to take longer to get there, but just look at what you're saving in terms of carbon emissions. And this is going to be the conundrum that a lot of buyers are going to have to face and deal with going forward. And that's why when I said in my introduction, difficult decisions will have to be made. That's what I was talking about. Because the only way we're going to get through this is to make those difficult decisions. And those difficult decisions is going to cost a bit of money. We have to make decisions whether to spend that money or to go business as usual. Next slide, please. So here's another poll question. If we can have the question, please. What is more important for your organization? Is it carbon data at the point of sale or carbon reporting down to the individual department? Let's see what you say about that. Again, not a big surprise here, because I suppose historically, when we do our reporting, we usually report to you at the end of a period of time. So if you can share the results, please. So historically within TMCs, what account managers tend to do is to give you what your management reports look like from what you've done in the previous quarter or the previous year. So carbon reporting at the point of sale has historically been the norm. But in order for us to be more proactive and ahead of the game, it's important that we give people that data before they actually make the decision to book travel, because that way it sensitizes them to, right, do I really want to, do I really have to do this trip given the amount of carbon emissions I'm going to emit? And therefore, it's nice to know that at least 60% of you now want to see that information before people actually travel. Sorry, I got that wrong. So it's no surprise that people are still accustomed to seeing data after the event rather than before they actually book. So you'll notice 41% are saying at the point of sale. We need to bring that up to, that needs to be closer to 80% now, because the decision not to emit carbon ought to be the decision whether you need to travel or not, and not afterwards. So that's an interesting one. Thanks for that, Grace. Next slide, please. So carbon data reports on demand is going to be very, very important here. But you'll notice in the previous slides, I was showing you exactly what the carbon, certainly what we're doing in terms of making sure that we're able to bring that carbon data to you before people actually book travel. That's a big ask, certainly within the travel industry to do. Well, that's something we're working assiduously hard towards, to make sure that people actually see what it is they're about to do, rather than just rely on historical reports. And while that's still important, we need to make sure that we're a bit more proactive, if you like. So in the here and now, in terms of carbon data reports, I talked about GoTo Insight. So the GoTo Insight tool that we have now provides access to that carbon data and the analysis that sits behind that. So you're able to see exactly what your carbon footprint looks like and whether or not you're headed in the right direction. And the ability to share that information with individuals and departments is going to be very crucial to making sure that people are very much aware of what it is they've done before. The data will clearly help in a number of ways. So one of the areas we're talking to a few of our clients about, because they've mentioned it, is to eliminate, if not eliminate, reduce those same-day trips, especially if they have to fly. Why do you really have to do a same-day trip? That's a huge amount of carbon emission being emitted. We know that in France, for instance, and I'm not sure whether it's law yet, but I think they've banned all domestic flights. I think they will. I can see Jayne nodding there. Yes, absolutely. Something tells me that's going to happen here.
I think they have.
Oh, they have.
I think they have banned all domestic flights. I don't think you can fly anywhere in France now.
Yeah.
And I know from some of the work I've been doing in the background, a couple of institutions have banned domestic flights for their travellers in the UK unless you're travelling further north than Glasgow and Edinburgh, because the trains through Scotland is not ideal.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that, Jayne. Something tells me it's going to happen here. It's going to happen here. We won't like it, and this is the difficult decision making I was alluding to earlier that will have to be made, or else we're just going to go around in circles doing the same thing and getting the same results. The data will also ask questions as to why so many people are traveling to the same destination at the same time. Now, of course, people will need to travel, and I'm not in any way saying, as a TMC, we want you to travel, but if you're all traveling, if you have 5-6 people going to Paris, for instance, and I'm sure they're going for all sorts of different reasons, there has to be coordination internally. And that's something, again, a challenge that needs to be unraveled, certainly internally within your respective organizations, to see, question, and really challenge why so many people have to go to the same destination. And can there be some kind of coordination between departments to make sure that that work is shared? So if someone's say taking the Eurostar or the train to Geneva, okay, so rather than maybe all of them flying there, you can have all of them taking the train there. They'll probably have to stay there for a bit longer. They can do a bit more work, and that way their net emissions start to show a reduction. Now, I'm not in any way saying that in and of itself is a panacea for all this, but we just have to think about this very differently and much more creatively in order to hit those objectives. But also, one thing you can do is introduce carbon leak tables. It sounds a little bit, maybe, I don't think it's petty at all. If you have interdepartmental league tables where you ask departments and set carbon credits, if you like, and you ask them, right, who's going to hit that credit at the earliest possible time, and give that department due recognition for that. I think your funders would be very happy about that, and certainly, you know, it just creates that race towards a very laudable objective to reduce those all-important carbon emissions. As I said, it's a huge ask for institutions, but going forward, this is the trajectory where everyone's going to be headed towards going forward. Next slide, please. Of course, we know people have to travel, so my strong advice is that you have an offset partner. We at Clarity, we use Climate Care. We've actually started working with another emissions offset provider called Trees for Life for a particular customer that we work with. But I think if you take nothing out from here, at least have an offset partner you need to be working with. And even if you have to work backwards that way, then that is a very good start. But I strongly advise that you have an offset partner, and that way at least you can actively start to do some real good work towards this objective. With Climate Care, I mean, they've really helped us, and we know exactly what our carbon footprint looks like. And as Andrew said in his during his session, yes, the cost of doing it is starting to rise, but it's inevitable because everyone's racing to this objective. So the quicker you're able to get a reputable partner that you can work with, and of course working with the likes of Greengage and others, you would set yourself on the track towards a more sustainable travel program.
We've got some good questions coming through, Patrick, so I wonder if we can move to, are we at the end of your slides there? I don't want to cut you off, Ellie, but we've got some really good questions coming through. Yeah,
there we are. It's question and answer time.
Okay. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap up because I don't think there's any more questions or anything else in the chat. So, Andrew, firstly, thank you so much. It was really, really interesting. And I think there's a lot of food for thought in there. And Patrick, thank you so much. And I think there's a lot of work that we've seen that you've done in the tool, and a lot of the, the measurement that can be done. And I think it's got some really interesting stuff, and, the innovation that you've got going forwards as well, I think is really interesting. So thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you very much, Patrick. And thanks, of course, Marion and Grace for doing the entire tech side of it. Marion, can you just talk through the slides and the recordings for us, please?
Absolutely. So everyone will get a copy of the slides from today and a copy of the recording. Patrick's also putting together a thought piece from Clarity on, some of the key themes we've talked about today that hopefully will help individuals as they consider this area going forward. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And Clarity will also be at our conference on the 8th of June. So bookings for that will open soon. Let us know, though, if you have feedback. We very much value that. If there were things that we didn't cover today that you think we need to in the future, if the level was right for you, if we needed to raise it, lower it, please let us know, and we'd very much like to offer one of these again. So thanks to all of you for attending and participating.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye now. Bye-bye.